A very good evening to all our viewers. Welcome to this week's edition of The Agenda. My name is Toibon Jabela, your host. Tonight on the show, we are very privileged to have two leading brains on issues of the economy. That is Dr. Frans Cronje. He is an independent analyst from South Africa, but he's in the country this week. He is, just a bit of background, Dr. Cronje is the author of two books on South Africa's future and scenarios from those books that have been presented to around 30,000 people, so many people. He writes for the rapport in South Africa and teaches scenario-based strategy at the Business School of the University of Free State. Doctor, thank you very much for being on the show tonight.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Yeah, really wonderful. We are also welcoming back our friend Roland Brown. He is with the Namibia, with the Economic Association of Namibia, rather. It's a very, very important think tank here in Windhoek that deals also with issues of economic analysis. It's good to have you back on the show, Roland.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, wonderful. I'll start with this new report that you have produced, you and I think a few others. A very, very wonderful report. I've gone through it quite thoroughly, and one of the key questions in the report is, will 90% of Namibians in gainful employment, or will 90% of Namibians be in gainful employment by 2030? Just maybe to start with you, Roland, first, why 90% by 2030? Is it a promise that we made by that year? And what is the answer to the question?
Well, you have to read the report for the latter portion.
Yeah.
But I think the context of the report is quite important. So we assembled a group of people to work on some scenarios for Namibia. And I think perhaps Frans can give us some info on how scenario planning works generally and so on.
Yeah.
But we felt that we talk a lot about Namibia being at a crossroads, and we're constantly at a crossroads, it seems. And we felt that we needed to look into what the potential scenarios for the future were.
Yeah.
With 30 years after independence, we sit with high unemployment, growing debt issues, a lot of sort of investment retreating and similar. And we felt, well, we need to look at where we are now and where we may be in the future. So the scenario planning process, one of the sort of foundations of it is you need to have a very clear question that you're asking, that you're trying to answer with your scenarios. And we spent quite a lot of time trying to identify what would be a suitable question. And we had about 20 people from different areas and with different expertise, different experiences, come together to try to identify what a suitable question was, and then many of the sort of factors that may influence the outcomes of that question, to your second point. For Namibia, we felt that this question of employment is probably the most important question. If you walk the streets here and ask people about government policies and things like that, they may not know very much. If you ask them what would be the single most important thing to make your life better, they would probably say a job. And we feel that there's actually a lot hidden within that answer that in terms of what it can tell you about your socioeconomic development and similar. We have this belief that people are quite good at helping themselves if they have, some basic means to do so. If you don't have to wait for somebody else to provide you with a toilet, provide you with access to running water, a house, etc. And if you have the means to do that yourself, and if a large portion of the population has the means to do that themselves, it tells you a lot about socioeconomic development and where we're likely to be, at the point in time where we have 90% of the population with a job. It also tells you a lot about the general state of the economy. So an economy that's creating jobs at a fairly rapid pace and that can get close to full employment is getting a lot of policy right. It's likely to be exporting on a substantial scale, whether goods or services, it's likely to have a fiscal situation that's relatively stable and sustainable. Your macro fundamentals are likely to be relatively good. And so we felt that there's a lot encapsulated in that question and the answer to that question around where Namibia would be in general if we were to say on that very measurable question, yes, we have achieved that. But the scenario planning process generally, where you take that question and you try to break that down into what are the potential scenarios that the country could face, and in those different scenarios, what's the likelihood of the answer to that question being yes? That's something that Frans has led us on and has provided us with a lot of expertise on.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, Frans, we have 2030 is only how many years from now? Is it 8
years?
8 years from now, and we are having. I think we are sitting on more than 30% unemployment right now in Namibia, and your specialty is in scenario planning. I mean, how do we get there? 2030, 8 years from now, juggling with the question of reducing unemployment to 10% only. I mean, is it even practical?
Yeah, it's perfectly practical.
Yeah.
That's sure. Think about major global and political events that have affected the Southern African region over the last 100 years. How many of those, even in your own experience as a journalist, the COVID pandemic, global financial crisis, 9/11 attacks, just as recent major ones, did analysts predict for you with a reasonable degree of accuracy, that they didn't take you by surprise? And the usual answer is not a lot. A lot of the stuff that the media breaks is kind of a surprise change in direction for a society.
Yeah.
But you'll notice something else, that after the fact, whether it was COVID or whether it was the global crisis, analysts were able to tell you why it happened in a high degree of detail. And they did so using information and data and trends that existed before the crisis. And that's a very important point, because it means the information we need to understand where a society or an economy is going to next, we already have that. We just don't often, as analysts, the bulk of analysts, know what to do with that kind of information. And what I try to do with clients is if you go on a journey, you sort of have a map. And I try and help clients build maps of where their economies or political systems may be headed towards to overcome this. So the promise, the objective is no surprises. We can sit here in this studio with you, we can talk through Namibia and in a short period of time and leave you in a position where nothing that you will report as a journalist over the next decade will be something that we didn't cover in this conversation in the next the minutes that we're going to be together. Go back to Namibia itself. I think, and I've felt for a long time, it's a more important corner of the world than I think many people outside understand, and I think than many people within Namibia understand. The assets, what you've got going for you, are absolutely immense. So list some. One asset you've got is that things in South Africa are not going very well. As a consequence, there is a lot of potential to draw out of South Africa expertise, investment, corporate headquarters, and the like, that are looking for a familiar territory, but one that is a more attractive operating environment. That is not, as a Namibian politician once put it to me, an attack on South Africa. The very best thing that can happen to South Africa now is that Namibia starts to outperform it, because it will motivate South African business and political leaders to try and be competitive. Second thing you've got going on in Namibia is your infrastructure is basically good and sound compared to lots of other emerging parts of the world. Your political culture is basically fundamentally free and open and easy to operate within. You've got an independent, we sit in it today, a strong, independent, often critical media. You sit on a large part of the Atlantic coastline. If you park a battleship off the Namibian coast and you point it in the right direction, you know, the next stop is New York. There's only a certain sort of numbers of miles of sea that separate you. That's strategically hugely important. There is a titanic struggle in the world between East and West, big dominant powers clashing with each other. And Africa sits right in the middle of that conflict. If African leaders play those great powers off against each other effectively, the benefits they can extract for themselves are absolutely immense. The Southern Cape Sea route remains strategically important in these power content stations to the same extent that it's been since sailing ships first set sail from their shores. You have a relatively small population. It's not that difficult to take you to a point of near full employment with the requisite investment and growth and the like. This report you're holding there in your hand was drafted 2.5 years ago. It was drafted on the dawn of the COVID pandemic. And that's largely the reason why it was only launched this week. When that was done, I said to Roland, we looked through it in the office, I said, this thing 2.5 years old is still largely perfectly valid for Namibia today. And one of the additional factors we'll get to in this conversation, we flagged in that report, is oil. You found that now. Maybe a lot of oil. Maybe enough to make you an influential global oil player. From outside, where I sit as an observer of Namibia's condition, it is not difficult to see how these factors I've listed for you, and others that we could bring in as well, if they are stacked up against each other in the correct way, can leave you in a position here where you become a society more prosperous, continuing to be stable, and one with an outsized influence on global affairs relative to your small population, and therefore relatively smaller GDP. So the report sought to map how might that potential play out to the upside, and what mistakes might be made along the way that causes that potential never to be realized.
No, thank you, Frans, for that. Roland, the buzzword, in the recurring theme in this report is around, among others, reforms. So reforms, is it something that requires a lot of capital, financial capital to effect? And are we in that position at all?
So the way that our process works here is that we go from that key question that we're trying to answer, and we go back and we say, what are the major considerations that we need to kind of consider when it comes to this? And we split that into what may happen that's of the highest impact and the highest uncertainty, and that gives us scenarios. In doing that, we identify specifically a question of what is our ability to reform? So Frans has given a very nice explanation of the potential that sits in Namibia. And I think most Namibians, and we talk about very similar things in our scenario presentations in general, we see the potential here is vast. And yet we don't always seem to realize that potential. Now, often the question of why that is, I think, is misanswered. Often the question is answered with, well, we don't know what to do. We don't have the information. We don't have the research. And I think that is completely incorrect. I think as the policymakers in the country, as civil society, private sector, we know exactly what we need to do to get Namibia from where it is to where it needs to be. It's just that for some reason we don't always do that. And all of that potential that Frans speaks of needs to be unlocked. And that speaks to one of the key factors that we looked at specifically here is our ability to reform as a nation, our ability to change, our ability to embrace some of those positives that Frans has mentioned, and to strategically position ourselves domestically and globally in order to become that very influential, disproportionately influential nation that we believe we could be. But that relies on this ability to reform. So are we able to make the legislative and similar changes that we need to make in order to embrace that? Or do we continue to sort of stagnate, struggling to implement some of the changes that we know need to be made in order to, for example, attract investment into the country, in order to bring in those job creators that we need in order to see jobs being created at the rate required to answer the question of whether we achieve 90% employment? Yes. So that's a very critical question. And one of the key sort of findings and one of the points that we make in the report is that if we don't reform, if we don't have this ability to reform, we can talk in perpetuity about being more investor friendly. We can talk in perpetuity about exchange control or work permits. These have been topics of discussion for decades. But if we don't have the ability to actually change that for whatever reason, it's very unlikely that the scenario that Frans sketches of this hugely influential Namibia comes to pass. And so that question, do we have an ability to reform or not, is very, very influential in terms of where Namibia finds itself in 2030. And we don't try to answer the question and say this is where we will be, but we say if we were to do these things, where do we end up? And if we look at and think about and discuss doing these things but never do, then where do we end up? And that's one of the critical questions that we try to identify here and look at the potential from.
Wonderful. We go for a quick break and return for the second half of the show.
AgriMonitor is jou weeklikse landboukundige program wat jou die jongste nuus in die landbouverwante bedryf en onderwerpe wat daaraan gekoppel is bring. Vir enige advertensie of nuusverwante navraag, kontak agrimonitor@synergy.com.na.
For news-related or advertising queries, contact irongotalk@synergy.com.na. Irongo Talk, our community, your news.
We continue our conversation on the agenda. Now, Frans, if we talk about reforms, Roland spoke about speaking in perpetuity, which means basically that we just, rambling on, but there's nothing effectively that we are doing. And I'm thinking of political will. How important is political will as an asset towards a process of reform?
Yeah, I think, it's critical, but I think behind political will it's another question of belief. That it's possible, that it can be done. And I do sometimes get the impression, being here occasionally, that domestically there's not a proper appreciation of just how big the potential influence of Namibia can be. Another way of seeing it is you might as an analyst travel to many corners of the world and deal with governments, policymakers and companies. And they might have problems. And let's take the Middle East as an example. You might spend a few days there, as I have now here, and you could leave there realizing that there's a lot of good that can be done, but you can't actually solve the problem in the short term. It's too difficult, it's too complex, there are too many competing players and conflicting interests to do so quickly. Namibia is a rare exception in the world, because here a lot of that stuff does not apply. Here the avenue to success is pretty clear and open. There aren't very influential interest groups that would be deeply committed to being obstacles to that process. I think more important than political will, but political will is very important, is firstly an understanding and belief of what the potential here really is. That Namibia can position itself as the type of country and society that when it appears on a global forum, people will want to see it and talk to it. I expect, and in fact, I'll tell you this, on the way here, a client said to me, where are you going? And I said, well, I'm going to Namibia. Up to 3 years ago, the answer would have been, well, that's nice, have a nice time. This time the question was, oh, that's very interesting. What is going on there? I expect that I'm going to, on the back of this trip, be able to go to a few places and say, I've just been in Namibia. And for the first time, someone's going to say, what is actually happening there? Because we hear things and potential and the like. And I think if that understanding and belief can be deeply established within political decision-making and business decision-making circles in Namibia, that's perhaps the first necessary step towards the process of realizing that very great potential, that modest targets of alleviating poverty or the like. These are no longer fit and proper targets for a society like Namibia. If it leverages that potential, this geostrategic location, even the question of oil, which I don't think is necessarily needs to be part of this mix. What oil is going to do for you is it's going to focus attention on your country and its great potential. If you harness that focus, that new kind of interest in Namibia, you'll achieve, potentially, if you play that well, economic and political benefits that would rival anything that might come from the pumping of oil, even if that one day occurs. So I'd probably leave here saying that the key central ingredient is a deep belief in being a great and influential society. If that's in place, you can probably inspire the political will, which is a necessary ingredient to get you to a point where your next challenge becomes, as Roland rightly tells you, the ability to actually do it on the ground, to drive the reforms that are necessary to harness that potential to ensure that relative greatness is realized.
Wonderful. Now, Roland, the report talks about, one of the scenarios here talks about, if implemented, if implemented to the letter, I suppose, we can witness a period of rapid and deep cutting reforms that could create as many jobs as 1.2 million jobs. Of course, Frans spoke about oil. I'm sure it's a big industry. If it takes off, there's a big talk about green hydrogen. Again, it's one of the flagship sort of projects of government at the moment. But in practical terms, when you talk about these reforms, what are we talking about exactly?
So that's a very important question. So one of the questions we ask here is, do we have an ability to reform?
Yeah.
And I think to date, certainly in the last few years, there's been great sort of stagnation when it comes to policy, when it comes to legislation. The Parliament role of legislation is not changed wildly, and especially on critical pieces of policy, there hasn't been much change, and many of those policies just remain gathering dust and brought out once every few years to be reviewed and so on. So I think we can fairly conclusively say that in the past few years, our ability to reform has been quite poor. The other question, though, is the one that you're getting to now, which is, if we do suddenly have a great ability to reform, if we start pushing through a lot of legislation and regulation, policy changes generally, what direction do those take? And what nature do they take? You mentioned something very interesting. You said green hydrogen is one of government's focuses. So is the reform that we see that sort of thing, where government says this is what we will be doing, we'll be doing this industry, we're going to pick winners, we're going to select special industries that we're going to give special attention to and make those industries work? Is it government saying we're going to be more prominent in tourism, we're going to be more prominent in banking, for example? And what is the nature of the sorts of reforms that we see pushed through? So let's assume that lots of pieces of policy go through Parliament. Lots of regulation and legislation gets passed. What direction does that take? And this is a very fundamental and very critical question. If the nature of that of that policy change is highly sort of centralist command and control, the outcomes would be vastly different from if it's more sort of free market. If it's more, let's let the world figure out whether green hydrogen makes sense without us as government having to push it. Let's let the world figure out, what industries make sense for Namibia, rather than government trying to pick winners. Let's use the intellectual capacity of everybody out there, rather than the 10 smart people in the room who, no matter how smart they may be, probably haven't thought of 1/10 of 1% of the potential that may lie within the country.
Yeah.
If the policy reforms are the latter, if the policy reforms are to say, let's embrace the expertise of the world, the ideas of the world, the capital of the world, I think that the outcomes can be very positive for the country, exceptionally positive for the country. In fact, exactly the things that Frans has been talking about. If we say, let's be very inward focused, let's use our own capital only, let's use our own ideas, those 10 very smart people in the small room coming up with a small number of ideas. Let's use our own expertise and try to dictate from on high what exactly we will be doing. Then I think the outcomes are unlikely to be as positive. So if one assumes that we want to achieve the things that Frans has been mentioning, to become a disproportionately influential global player, to be the nation that people look to as the African success story when it comes to oil, when it comes to natural resources, when it comes to development generally, and to be this diamond on the west coast of Africa, then I think the reforms are exactly what we've been talking about now for many years, but it's this ability to implement them that matters. So can you get the skills you need to start and run a business in the country? Can you bring in the people that you need if they're not available here?
Yeah.
We talk about the labor market in Namibia as if it's a single point, that we have there's labor and that's it. We don't talk about the fact that if you want to do green hydrogen, we don't have green hydrogen experts. Perhaps with time we will, but if you want those skills, you need them. If you want to lay bricks, we do have those skills, and we need to look at this a little bit more with a little bit through a little bit more refined glasses, let's say, and say where there aren't skills, it needs to be easy to get those skills. It can't be a big fight with Home Affairs every year when you have to renew your oil executive's work permit. The same with regards to capital. Can you get capital into the country without a big hassle? But equally importantly, if you're a foreign investor that comes to invest in Namibia, can you take that capital out again? Because nobody puts money into an economy they can't remove it from. Questions around, various different questions around the general business climate. If we want to be an oil-focused and oil-dependent country, then sure, we can probably get away with our current tax regimes. But if we want to be diversified, we need to be competitive from a tax perspective. And we need to make sure that those tax revenues are being utilized to avoid having people left behind as efficiently as possible. But are we competitive from a tax perspective, and are we competitive from a non-tax cost of doing business perspective? If you apply for licenses, if you apply for environmental clearances, if you apply for farm waivers, etc., are those applications handled efficiently? And where there's a net negative impact of having certain regulation in place, is that removed? Do we apply a one-size-fits-all regulatory model to a big bank and a small bank, a big asset manager, a small asset manager, a big media house and a small media house? Or do we have a sort of sandpit type of model that makes it easier for small enterprises to function and to grow and to become big enterprises, etc.? So the nature of the reforms is just as important as our ability to reform. So it's not good enough to just say we're great at reforming. In fact, if we reform in the wrong direction aggressively and we become very inward-looking and very nationalist, we may well find ourselves going backwards, and I think that's exactly what our scenarios suggest. If we have very inward-looking reform, if we start to nationalize, if we start to have government more and more involved in parts of the economy that government has limited expertise on, and if we become more and more inward-focused on the small pool of capital that's available here, as opposed to the vast pool of capital that's available around the world, then we could be very positively counterproductive in terms of outcomes.
Frans, the paper talks about, I suppose, as part of also the proposed scenarios for reform, that if the government took the policy approach of gradually reducing its involvement in commercial parts of the economy, and I suppose allow the private sector to play a more leading role in that regard, how important is that aspect towards what we want to achieve here?
It's very important. Here's the example. There's wonderful research being done on the future of the world of work. What will young people do in their careers? What jobs will they do? And a result of a lot of that is that we don't know. And that a lot of young people who we're training today will work in industries that now don't exist, doing jobs that we cannot imagine. It's very hard, therefore, to imagine that private sector or state planners can, on a micro, small level, decide what kind of economy they want to create and what industries they want to compete in, because we just don't know what it's going to be. And you might occasionally find a planner who says, well, they can, but did you call Uber? Did you know that it was coming? If you're in the hotel industry, did you see Airbnb emerging to become the biggest accommodation type business in the world, doesn't own a single a piece of real estate itself? There's an important role for government to work at planning, therefore, on a macro level as opposed to a micro level. And the macro level, planning works well when you create an environment where any competitive risk-taking enterprise, we don't know now what it is because we can't anticipate it yet, is able to succeed. That is the objective. You can see a flip side of that coin and ask the question, what is it in coming to Namibia or in being in the country that at all makes it difficult for you to establish a small risk-taking enterprise? The more of that stuff that's rolled back, the more competitive Namibia becomes. The greater the opportunity is that it leverages the renewed interest, which is going to rise immensely in the next few years in the country, to a point where you can create those million jobs and you can create full employment. So it's not a laissez-faire libertarian piece of advice. There's an extremely important role for states in the world, and Namibian state no different. But it will profit politically and economically more from attempting to stay at the macro level than interfering at the micro level to try and compete in industries that are often... I mean, the question I sometimes put to people who challenge this is, you know, where was any element of the government that you're involved in busy in planning sort of big new public transport schemes, and did they factor in a concept such as Uber in that at any point in the last 20 years? And I don't think there are any that did that. Get the macro stuff right, and you will leverage the renewed interest in Namibia to the extent that you will achieve successes potentially on a spectacular scale that I think few people around the world, and I think relatively few in Namibia too, can at this point imagine is possible.
Frans makes a very important point there. So I think we're not, if you read through this report, you'll note that the general reform approach, whether you call it right or left, the general reform approach that one's talking about is, do you have active reform if you assume an ability to reform? Do you have active reform that's very micro in nature, that says that your business must be run like this, it can only participate in these parts of the economy, it can only do this little thing or that little thing, it can only employ these people, etc. Is that the nature of the reform we see? Macro, inward focused type of reform? Or is it this macro type of reform where we're not talking about an anarchy or a society with no rules or laws and where there's no government? Certainly not, that would be absurd. What we're talking about is a movement away from that micro type of focus to a much more large scale focus. So rather than saying this is the industry that we'll be involved in as a country, we say this is a country that's open. You can come and invest here. You must pay your tax. There are certain rules around what you are and aren't allowed to do here. You may not abuse our environment. You may not abuse our people per se, et cetera, et cetera. So there are rules, but those rules are much more macro focused, and it's not meddling, let's say, at a very low level in the individual decisions taken by both individuals as individuals and individuals as representative of businesses.
Indeed. I think before you go for the break, I just wanted to ask also, there's a part in the report that says that true reform is thwarted by ideological elements that see redistribution and government control of the economy as a requirement to remedy injustices of the past, as well as vested interests that are redistribution as a simpler route to greater wealth than innovation and work. I mean, I don't know if I understand when you talk about the injustices of the past. I suppose is we're talking about the political history of our country, which was, of course, very segregating racial groups and whatnot. How do we address those injustices which are a reality while still maintaining the momentum of growth that we want to see? Maybe
let's make it a practical question.
Yeah.
Go back to the title of this report, 90% of people in employment there.
Yeah.
The present Namibian data on young people, I think, is that your unemployment rate is approaching around 50%. So the practical answer to your question would include the idea that can you take those young people not in employment for various reasons, including the past of the Southern African region. How do you get them out of that into a position where they are independent actors, earning incomes, caring for their own families, contributing as taxpayers to building a great Namibia? There's a watershed in approach. One is attempting to redistribute existing resources to the point where that result is achieved. On the maths of it, it cannot work. The moral arguments and the political arguments are different, but on the economic maths, it is not a result that can ever be achieved through that trajectory or line of thinking. By drawing enormous interest into Namibia and leveraging that interest to turn it into risk-taking entrepreneurship and growth, you actually have a very good chance of addressing that. If you've done that in Namibia as business community, as civil society, as the Namibian government, and we see a point in the future where 9 out of 10 Namibians of working age are gainfully employed, their lives improving, I think you will be about as close as you will ever come to beginning to answer the question on redress by saying, yes, we did it right, and we are becoming the kind of society that we should always have been, implicit in which is, yes, you have achieved, you're well on your way to achieving redress for the colonial and apartheid era pasts of Southern Africa.
Yeah, indeed. We go for the last break of the show. Stay tuned.
NMH Ad 1 brings you news from all across Namibia. If you would like to feature your brand or campaign on this platform, contact NMH1 at synergy.com.na. NMH Ad 1, your lunchtime news companion.
In Business 7, you get news on current economic, financial, and business matters in Namibia. The weekly show features interviews with experts and in-depth analysis of burning issues in a way that caters for ordinary Namibians and business connoisseurs alike. We crunch the numbers that matter, decipher statistics that shape Namibian lives, discuss smart money, and explore the impact of global development locally. Money makes the world go round, so catch us on NTV, oneup2.com, and the Facebook platforms of the Namibian Sun, Republikane, Algemeine Zeitung, and Namibia Media Holdings. For news-related or advertising queries, please contact B7 at synergy.com.na.
Sunset News is a daily news show focusing on national headlines as well as international news. If you'd like to feature your brand or campaign on this platform, please contact sunset at synergy.com.na. Sunset News. Don't end your day without us.
We continue the show. Roland, if you can also address me on the question that I posed to Frans earlier about striking that balance between addressing the past injustices without destroying the trajectory of growth.
Yeah, so I think it's a very important question, and I think some context perhaps on the scenario that's drawn up here. So we're not saying that this is the status quo per se, but we're saying if you look into the future, this is likely to be one of the considerations around our ability to reform. So whether we have a sort of national direction, let's say, or whether we're sort of floating in no man's land without a huge amount of direction in terms of where we're going. And the concern that we sit with is that the current system is not working for the majority of people, I think. And so there's a big question around, well, do we do more of what we're doing, or do we need to change tack completely? And with, as Frans has mentioned, a third of the population unemployed, and with half of the young people of the country unemployed, clearly we have a system that's not rectifying the wrongs of the past in any meaningful manner in terms of lives in the present. So the big question here, and Frans mentioned a big portion of this is a simple mathematical equation. Yeah. If you redistribute everything that exists in the country, nobody ends up with very much. In fact, you're left miles behind most of the rest of the world in terms of the ownership of assets, in terms of income, and similar. And it's unlikely that anybody that has capital is going to deploy that into a country that's actively redistributing. And if you start doing that, where does it stop? So now you've become quite successful. And you've bought yourself a Land Cruiser, and you've started a small business, etc., etc. But you've become disproportionately well off compared to the population. What is to say that there's not a second round of redistribution where we say, well, this is not fair because perhaps you had a good education that somebody else didn't have, and that's how you've got ahead, and now we need to resolve that. So we don't really see that as a long-term solution. It's very understandable from a political sense, and similar why some may want that. But from a mathematical perspective, it doesn't really work. And from a future perspective for the country, it doesn't really work. So if we want to make people's lives better, we need to figure out a way for people to get ideally a sustainable long-term income at household level. It's very difficult to do that through a system of redistribution, and the system specifically that we generally should be using for redistribution, if you assume a sort of normalized society, is the tax system. And if you consider in Namibia, we've got a very small number of taxpayers, fewer than 200,000 individuals paying tax, and 2.5 million people. The ability for those 200,000 people to pay enough tax in order to redistribute that out to the public and to improve people's lives significantly, it's mathematically, it simply doesn't work. And so that method of creating an income at household level, a sustainable income at household level that can improve people's lives, is absolutely critical. And given that we know we can't really do it through a redistributive system, the best option that is available to us, and that's actually the best option that's available to most of the world, is to try to find ways to ensure that as many people as possible have an income at household level from some kind of productive pursuit, so from working. And that's the kind of key question we're trying to answer here. If you have that income at household level, imagine you have even 2 or 3 persons in a household earning minimum sort of wage type income, so 3,000 NAM dollars a month or similar, 2 or 3 of those incomes in a household. Suddenly that household is actually able to do a few things for itself. It's able to get its own water, its own electricity put in over time, toilets, etc., etc. The impact that can have is enormous in terms of improving that household's lot in life. And if we want to move in that direction, which I think from a developmental perspective as a nation we certainly should want to do, we need to find ways to ensure that households have those incomes. And if you take that argument one step forward, well, obviously in order for households to have income from employment, we need there to be more employers. And then you have to ask the question, well, what does it take for a country to have a lot more employers?
Just out of interest, Roland, because you seem to be very passionate about the aspect of households being able to sustain themselves. You mentioned it now, you mentioned it in your introductory remarks. What is your assessment of the current scenario in our country? Because there's always this huge debate about whether the government was too much into social spending, for example. This week I took a cab and a taxi driver was telling me, he was complaining bitterly about what he thinks is a very bad culture that we are creating in a country. About, of course, he was talking about the food bank that we used to have here, saying, you know, why are we feeding people, bringing food to their doorsteps, instead of actually properly empowering them so that they can sustain themselves, because there's more to their needs than just food. Your assessment of our current situation in the country, do you think that, I mean, the balance between spending into productive sectors to create that scenario that you want, versus the spending of social safety nets and all those things. What is your assessment of the current scenario?
So I think you have to look at everything holistically. And if you go and you ask any person, would you rather have an income that you work for, that you generate, that's able to sustain you, or would you like to depend on handouts from the state for food, wait for somebody else to give you a toilet, etc., etc.? They will tell you that they would like to have their own income, that their primary interest would be to be able to support themselves and to generate their own income. There will be a hyper minority or minority that may have a different answer, but the majority of people want to have their own incomes and to have the pride and ability to make decisions around the allocation of those incomes themselves. The reason that that's perhaps not the case here, I think, is quite an interesting question. And I think we have a very well-resourced state, and we've got one of the highest tax revenue to GDP ratios in the world. So we have a very well-resourced state relative to the size of the economy. And there's a very fundamental question around how that money is utilized and whether it's utilized in an effective manner in order to improve people's lives in a sort of long-term sustainable manner. And then in addition to that, we have to look at, well, why do we have this big problem where there is so much state dependency? And state dependency is very linked to the fact that we have very high levels of unemployment. So if you go one step further again, you come back to the same kind of point. So why do we have such high levels of unemployment? If we want to address high levels of unemployment, we need a large number of employers. We've got a surplus of employees, not enough employers. How do we create more employers? And you get back into that sort of general realm of thinking that I've expressed earlier. When it comes to the state's allocation of resources, I think there's a number of major problems. And I think that this goes from spending money on defunct SOEs, it's general prioritization, it's also return on spending. So we spend a huge amount on education, for example. We roughly double the global average in terms of spending on education, and yet our school leaving results are about half the global average when you take critical things such as maths and English, or maths and language. And so the return on that spend is poor. So there's a number of issues around the allocation of public resources and the return that is derived from the use of those public resources. So it may well be the case that spending a lot of money on education is a good thing, but that doesn't mean that you can spend an infinite amount on education and not have certain expectations and requirements with regards to the return thereon. And I think that's exactly where we sit at the moment.
Yeah. Doctor, do us the honor of, I'm throwing the last dice of this game to you, and that is, you're coming from South Africa, and it's a very vibrant country, both economically and politically. And the report talks about cronyism, nepotism, and conflicting ideological ideologies basically within the ruling elite. So we have these scenarios here in black and white. And we are saying if this happens, this is what is likely to transpire by 2030 or beyond. How then is it important that we contain things like cronyism, things like nepotism, corruption itself, in order really for us to march on?
They'll be contained on their own because we are fundamentally free and open societies. I'm not familiar with your data as much as with South Africa's, but on South Africa I have very deep insight into political trends. And South Africa, probably like Namibia 20, 30 years ago, became free societies, so that if a point was reached where their governments were not able to meet the expectations of their people, then the people would have the ability to be a change agent. The political data in South Africa is showing that that is very much the case. And that on a lag time, in the face of disappointment and following an era of protests, should any government, let's talk generally, in a free and open society not meet the expectations of its people, the people will bring about a degree of political change. In Southern Africa, I think in South Africa, that will happen through the ballot box. So there is an inbuilt check and balance. We can try in our own efforts to be influential on that, but the public ultimately has a veto power. And I expect that in this region more and more, where governments don't meet popular expectations, we will see that veto power being exercised.
Gentlemen, it was a pleasure having both of you on the set tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was tonight's edition of The Agenda. Thank you for watching and have a lovely evening.
3, 2, 1.
We Talk brings you community news that lies at the heart of Windhoek residents. If you would like to feature your brand or campaign on this platform, contact wetalk@synergy.com.na. You live, we talk.
The Regional Review brings you news, views, and interviews from NMH correspondents from across the country. If you would like to feature your brand or campaign on this platform, contact regional@synergy.com.na.
Africa Good Morning is a current affairs program that brings you the latest from Southern Africa and beyond. News, economics, sport, weather, interviews, and so much more. For any advertising or news-related queries, contact agm@synergy.com.na. Africa Good Morning, bringing Africa to you.
The Agenda is a weekly national affairs interview program hosted every Sunday by Namibian Sun editor Toyvon Jabela, featuring a panel of high-profile newsmakers, analysts, and experts. If you would like to feature your brand or campaign on this platform, contact agenda@synergy.com.na. The Agenda, focused on today's conversation.
Careers Bistro focuses on the movers and shakers in the corporate world. If you would like to feature your brand or campaign on this platform, contact zone@synergy.com.na.
For news-related or advertising queries, contact irongotalk@synergy.com.na. Irongo Talk, our community, your news.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, welcome to another exciting edition